Everywhere you look, Jesus is present. Street names, hymns, paintings, public holidays, entire cities built around his memory. His image is stitched into law, art, and the calendars of billions. Yet when we set out to find physical traces that can be tied, with any confidence, to the man from Nazareth, the trail is unexpectedly thin. How do we reconcile the enormous cultural footprint with the scarcity of artifacts that could be tied directly to a single provincial Jew of the early 1st century? This is the question that animates our investigation, uncovering the hidden historical evidence of Jesus. Not to prove or disprove theological claims, but to ask, as historians must, what empirical traces survive, and what degree of confidence those traces can sustain. To do this well, we need to distinguish kinds of evidence: stone, bones, inscriptions, and letters, and to read each one with the right questions. Who wrote this? When was it written? Does it record an eyewitness memory or a later tradition? And crucially, what are reasonable expectations for the material remains of a low-status Galilean in a world where preservation was uneven and context often lost? It helps to begin with a contrast. Powerful rulers and monumental projects often leave stones and coins that survive centuries. Provincial figures, especially those outside political centers, very rarely do. Archaeology is not a neutral magnifying glass. It's a searchlight biased by social status, building materials, burial practices, and the accidents of preservation and discovery. A carpenter from a village in Galilee, who taught in open air, whose followers were initially a small rural movement, was not producing monumental inscriptions. He was not minting coins. He did not have a named mausoleum, or at least none that we have securely identified. That does not mean he left no footprint at all, but it does mean our expectations must be modest and methodical. If you want to follow this full investigation, subscribe now. We'll sift through inscriptions, disputed ossuaries, Roman historians, Jewish chroniclers, and the earliest Christian letters to build a careful picture of what the surviving evidence actually supports. To understand the archaeological dimension, we must first ask what counts as an archaeological anchor. At root, it is a datable, contextually secure object or inscription that can be connected by names, titles, or provenance to a person or event. But context matters more than a name. A name on stone discovered in a sealed archaeological stratum carries far more weight than the same name written later on a stone whose origin is uncertain. Provenance, where an item was found, under what conditions, recorded by whom, is the historian's safeguard against deception and misinterpretation. That is why the discovery circumstances of an artifact are often as important as the words carved on it.
One of the clearest archaeological anchors connected to the world of early Christianity is not a relic of Jesus or his followers, but a stone that mentions a Roman official, the inscription naming Pontius Pilate. In the early 1960s, an inscribed limestone block was found in the ruins of a building at Caesarea Maritima. The block bears a Latin dedication, which includes the name Pontius Pilate and his title, an epigraphic confirmation of a figure otherwise known from textual sources. For historians, this stone matters because it places Pilate concretely into the material record and helps anchor other literary references to the first third of the 1st century CE. It is not evidence for Jesus himself, but it demonstrates two important points. First, that certain provincial officials do leave traceable marks on the landscape. Second, that even for such officials, the archaeological footprint can be surprisingly sparse, one inscription among many lost records. Why emphasize this? Because expectations are often shaped by modern sensibilities. We imagine that if a person changed the world, they must have left abundant physical traces. But the archaeological record of the ancient Mediterranean is notoriously incomplete and biased toward durable, public, and wealthy expressions. The governor who commissioned a public building might be mentioned on a glorifying stone. The itinerant teacher with a small rural following probably would not be. The Pilate inscription, therefore, is better understood as a benchmark. If a Roman prefect can be attested by a single honored stone, the absence of a comparable monument for a provincial present is not by itself surprising or suspicious. Yet archaeology has produced items that sparked hopes of a more direct connection to early Christian figures, and among these, the most debated is the so-called James ossuary. An ossuary is a bone box, a limestone container used in certain Jewish burial customs of the late Second Temple period to hold the bones collected after decomposition. Ossuaries provide searchable inscriptions. The James ossuary bears an Aramaic inscription, often rendered in English as James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. When it was brought to public attention in the early 2000s, the inscription generated headlines. Could this be a physical object referencing James, traditionally identified as the brother of Jesus? If authentic, such an inscription would be a rare movable object that connects a named family member to the name Jesus in the right period. The initial excitement, however, immediately ran into methodological problems. First, the context. The ossuary surfaced on the antiquities market, not as part of a documented archaeological excavation. Objects without clear archaeological provenance are inherently problematic because their find spot, the layer they come from, the associated date-bearing materials, the other artifacts around them, is unknown.
An ossuary taken from its original context loses much of its evidentiary power. A single inscription in isolation can be interpreted in multiple ways. Second, name frequency is a complicating factor. By the 1st century, names like Yeshua, Jesus, Yosef, Joseph, and Yaakov, James, were common among Jewish men. The coincidence of 2 or 3 common names appearing together is far from impossible. Put bluntly, the names by themselves do not automatically identify famous biblical figures. We therefore must combine epigraphic detail with statistical reasoning and context. Is the phrasing unique? Does the paleography, the letter forms, date the inscription to the correct century? Does the patina that formed over the inscription match an ancient origin or indicate recent additions? These technical questions quickly turn what looks like a simple inscription into a forensic puzzle. Third, scientific testing produced contested results. Different laboratories examined the patina, the thin mineral layer that forms on the surface of stone over time, and reached divergent conclusions about whether the patina covered the inscription uniformly or whether parts of the inscription had been carved later and artificially patinated. The Israeli Antiquities Authority charged the object's owner with forgery, and the case that followed brought intense public attention to the ossuary. But criminal trials focus on legal standards and admissible proof, not on scholarly consensus about authenticity. Some analysts argue that the inscription is ancient, while others pointed to anomalies suggesting later intervention. In the end, the legal and scientific ambiguities left the academic community divided. Some scholars regard the ossuary as potentially authentic, but not conclusively demonstrative. Others consider the evidence insufficient to claim a direct link to the James of the New Testament. The James ossuary episode shows how different kinds of uncertainty can compound: uncertain provenance, common names, and conflicting scientific readings. When the background context is missing, the safest historiographical posture is caution. An object like an ossuary can be suggestive, it can provoke research and debate, but it cannot, by itself and absent secure find spot and uncontested testing, settle the question of identity or historicity. Beyond the James ossuary, there are other archaeological lines that are relevant if we cast our net wider. Tombs, household remains in Galilean villages, fragments of synagogues, and pottery assemblages tell us about daily life, dietary habits, and community structure. They help construct the social world in which an itinerant teacher would have moved. Discoveries of 1st century synagogues and Galilean towns show active Jewish congregations and reading cultures. Inscriptions in Greek and Aramaic reveal the linguistic diversity of the region. Coins and building inscriptions allow us to date phases of occupation.
But the survival of an object does not equate to a firm link to an individual, unless an inscription names that person and is securely connected to a reliable context. And even then, commonality of names often forces historians to weigh probabilities instead of certainties. To assess archaeological claims, we use a toolbox of methods that deserve a brief explanation. Paleography examines handwriting and letter forms to estimate a date range. It is comparative and probabilistic rather than absolute. Patina analysis studies mineral deposits on stone surfaces. Congruent patina over an inscription and the rest of an artifact suggests antiquity, but patina can be artificially replicated, and interpretation is technical. Stratigraphy and sealed contexts, layers undisturbed since antiquity, are gold standards for dating because they anchor objects in time with associated datable materials. Scientific techniques like portable X-ray fluorescence can analyze elemental composition, but they cannot always determine when or by whom an inscription was carved. When artifacts come from controlled excavations, several lines of evidence converge and produce stronger conclusions. When they emerge from the antiquities market, gaps multiply. Another factor that shapes archaeological expectations is burial practice. Ossuaries were used predominantly in Judea among certain social groups in the late 1st century BCE through the 1st century CE. They are not universal. Many Jews of the period were buried in earth or in simple graves, leaving no portable containers that survive. Perishable materials, wood, textiles, leather, usually decay. If Jesus and his immediate circle were of modest means, they may never have used ossuaries, or if they did, those ossuaries may have been lost or destroyed. The same logic explains why we find some famous names on inscriptions while many others vanish into silence. Preservation is uneven and selective. The archaeology thus supplies constraints and occasional anchors, but does not deliver a neat catalog of items attributable to Jesus. Its principal value is contextual. It helps reconstruct the world in which early Christian traditions emerged. It also supplies peripheral confirmations, for example, the existence of Pontius Pilate as a titled governor, that bolster textual claims when those claims identify the right offices and historical backdrops. But when it comes to items explicitly naming Jesus, the archaeological record remains thin, contested, and often ambiguous. This brings us to an important methodological distinction: primary versus secondary evidence. An object inscribed by an eyewitness or a contemporary community, say a dedication carved while the person was alive, or a tomb label within a securely dated stratum, is primary. A later inscription in a different city that quotes a tradition is secondary.
For the study of Jesus, most of our direct textual attestations are secondary, in that they are written after the events described and often shaped by theological aims. Archaeological items can be primary, but without secure context, they risk being secondary salvage specimens. Both types of evidence must be read together, not in isolation. Having set the archaeological baseline, modest expectations, a handful of contested movable objects, and a few solid inscriptions that illuminate the administrative environment, our inquiry now turns to what ancient authors outside Christian communities reported. Unlike potsherds and ossuaries, literary texts travel through transmission chains, copying and recopying, and their reliability turns on authorship, date, intent, and source materials. These non-Christian writers, Roman historians, satirists, and provincial officials, never set out to write Christian propaganda. That distance from the movement can make their references especially valuable, but it also means they often report second-hand information, sometimes centuries after the events they describe. The question for us is not whether these authors prove every claim in the Gospels, but whether their testimony converges on core historical points: that there was a figure called Jesus, or something very close, that he was the object of a movement, and that he was executed under Roman authority. To evaluate such testimony, we must examine each author's context: when they wrote, who their audience was, what their sources might have been, and whether their report likely reflects a contemporary memory, a rumor, or a polemical target. Some of these writers have short, passing mentions that are nevertheless significant precisely because they are independent of Christian claims. Others are satirists who weaponize or mock religious movements, and in their mockery we sometimes detect details that derive from earlier traditions rather than complete invention. But these are textual arguments to be explored carefully, line by line, with attention to dating and motive, a task we will begin in the next section, where we turn to Roman and Greek testimonies that commentators have long used to triangulate the historical Jesus. We left off with the question of what Roman and Greek writers, authors who were neither Christian nor Jewish partisans, actually recorded about the figure at the center of this inquiry. Their remarks are rarely long, sometimes sardonic, and often second-hand, yet precisely because they are external to Christian origins, they deserve careful attention. We begin with a short portrait of each author, and then consider, line by line, what their testimony can and cannot support. Tacitus wrote his Annals in the early 2nd century, probably during the reign of Trajan or slightly later. He is widely respected as a careful Roman historian, concerned with imperial administration and major events.
In his passage about the fire of Rome and Nero's reaction, Tacitus mentions that Nero blamed a class hated for their vices, called Christians, and that Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. 2 points are crucial here. First, Tacitus is not a Christian. His reference to Christus is a Roman framing of a foreign movement. Second, Tacitus wrote about 80 to 90 years after the events in question and is relying on imperial records or popular memory. His report is therefore not an eyewitness account, but an independent attestation that a man called Christ, or at least a figure identified as the origin of the movement, was executed under Roman authority in Judea. For historians, this convergence with other lines of evidence is important. Tacitus corroborates, at one remove, the identification of Jesus as a crucified figure and places that execution in a Roman administrative context. Tacitus's motive is not to verify theological claims. He aims to document a scandalous episode in Rome and to explain the origins of a sect blamed for unrest. The passage does not prove details of Jesus' life, nor does it vouchsafe supernatural claims. It is, however, a non-Christian report tying the movement to a persecuted founder and to Pilate. Pliny the Younger, writing as governor of Bithynia Pontus around 111 to 113 CE, composed a famous letter asking the Emperor Trajan how to proceed with people accused of being Christians. Pliny reports that Christians gather to sing hymns to Christ as to a god, share meals, and bind themselves by oath to moral conduct. Pliny's letter is striking for two reasons. It treats Christianity as a living social phenomenon that had reached Asia Minor by the early 2nd century, and it records that these people worshipped Christ in a devotional context. Pliny is not claiming to know Jesus personally. His interest is pragmatic, legal, and administrative. But his testimony independently confirms that by the early 2nd century, there was an organized movement centered on a figure called Christ, and that adherents worshipped him as divine. Again, Pliny's testimony is not about Jesus' biography. It documents the cultic self-understanding of early Christians. Suetonius, another Roman writer of the early 2nd century who specialized in imperial biographies, includes a brief reference to disturbances among Jews in Rome during the reign of Claudius, noting that the emperor expelled the Jews who constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus. Scholars debate whether Chrestus refers to Christ or whether Suetonius was simply recording a separate agitator. The passage's ambiguity demonstrates a larger methodological lesson. Ancient naming practices, spelling variations, and a writer's imperfect grasp of foreign terms can complicate our interpretation.
Suetonius's note does not provide a clear portrait of Jesus, but it does suggest that in the Roman mind, unrest connected to a foreign religious figure was a recognized phenomenon. Lucian of Samosata, a Greek satirist writing in the mid-2nd century, mocks Christians in ways that betray details about their origin story. He ridicules them for worshiping a crucified sage who established a new law. Lucian is hostile and comedic rather than historically neutral, but satirists often depend on recognizable facts to land their punches. In Lucian's caricature, we detect an independent echo of a crucified founder who inspired a devoted following. Celsus, an earlier critic whose writings survive only through the responses of the Christian theologian Origen, produced a hostile polemic in the late 2nd century denouncing Christian claims. Fragments attributed to Celsus critique Christian narratives and reflect debates within the Greco-Roman intellectual world. While these opponents seek to undermine Christian claims, their very engagement with Christian tradition provides indirect testimony that early Christian claims were known and discussed across the empire. Taken together, what do these Greco-Roman testimonies amount to? They do not supply a detailed life history. None of these writers claims to have been an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry in Galilee. None furnishes a datable contemporary document produced in Judea during Jesus' lifetime. What they do supply is independent confirmation of three modest but significant points. A movement existed and was called after a founder. That founder was associated with crucifixion under Roman authority, and the movement had spread beyond Palestine by the early 2nd century. For historians comparing the relative weight of evidence, such convergence from outside observers increases plausibility for the core claim that a historical figure lay behind the movement. The Greco-Roman sources cannot answer questions about Jesus' sayings or precise chronology, but they do resist the thesis that Christianity arose as a purely imaginative invention disconnected from any historical actor. Now we move to Jewish testimonies, where the evidence becomes both more direct and more contested. The most famous Jewish historian relevant here is Flavius Josephus, a Jewish aristocrat who served Rome and wrote Antiquities of the Jews around 93-95 CE. Josephus contains two passages often discussed in relation to Jesus. The shorter, less controversial one concerns James, the brother of Jesus who was called the Christ, and describes his execution. Most scholars accept this reference as authentic in its core, even if phrasing may have been lightly smoothed by later copyists, because it fits Josephus's interests and style, and because it is entangled with Josephus's otherwise reliable reporting on Judean affairs.
This passage matters because it names James as the brother of Jesus called Christ, offering an independent non-Christian linkage between a historical leader of the Jerusalem community and a figure identified as Jesus. Even if a scribe added who was called Christ later, the contextual fit and manuscript tradition make the James notice a strong piece of evidence attesting to the early existence of a Jesus tradition in Palestinian Jewish memory. The second Josephus passage, the so-called Testimonium Flavianum in Book 18, is more problematic. The traditional form found in many medieval manuscripts paints a strongly Christian portrait. Josephus speaks of Jesus as a wise man, doer of wonderful deeds, and the Messiah, even recounting belief in resurrection. Scholars have long argued that Christian copyists likely polished or interpolated Josephus's lines to make them read more sympathetically to Christian readers. The debate centers on two questions. Did Josephus write nothing about Jesus at all, or did he write a neutral or lightly critical sentence that later scribes expanded? Many contemporary scholars favor a middle position. Josephus probably wrote a passage mentioning Jesus as a wise teacher and noting that followers persisted after his death, but Christian scribes embellished the passage with explicit confessional language and theological claims. Attempts to reconstruct a plausible original, removing overtly Christian phrases while maintaining Josephus's style, produce a paragraph that would read as a Jewish historian's neutral report about a controversial figure whose movement persisted.
That reconstruction, if accepted as plausible, means Josephus provides a non-Christian near-contemporary reference to a Jesus figure who had followers and whose movement continued after his execution. But because of the clear evidence of later Christian editorial activity, the testimonium cannot be used as straightforward, uncontested proof. It remains a contested but potentially valuable witness when treated with care. Beyond Josephus, rabbinic literature and anti-Christian Jewish traditions complicate the picture. The Talmud includes passages that refer to a figure named Yeshu, a Hebrew-Aramaic form related to Yeshua, Jesus, often in hostile tone and embedded in legal and political contexts. These texts were compiled and redacted centuries after the events, and often reflect rhetorical strategies rather than reliable historical reportage. Similarly, the medieval Tola.Yeshu narratives are explicitly polemical retellings, sometimes grotesquely hostile, and were written long after the 1st century. Historians approach these materials cautiously. While such texts preserve evidence of Jewish-Christian conflict and show how Jewish communities later remembered and contested Christian claims, they are not straightforward primary sources for reconstructing the life of Jesus in the 1st century.
They do, however, demonstrate that Jewish traditions about Jesus existed and that polemical memory interacted with Christian claims in complex ways. The essential point about Jewish testimonies is nuance. Some references, like the James passage in Josephus, carry substantial historical weight. Others are late, polemical, or contaminated by Christian editorial activity, and thus must be used with calibrated caution. When combined with Greco-Roman and Christian testimonies, however, the Jewish notices contribute to a cumulative picture. By the end of the 1st century, there were multiple attestations across cultural boundaries that a man named Yeshua, had been associated with a movement and had relatives and followers known to contemporaries. This brings us to the earliest Christian sources, which are central to any historical account because they are the closest text to the events and because they explicitly claim to transmit memory of Jesus. Here we must be precise. Not all New Testament writings are equal in date or historical value. Some letters attributed to Paul are widely regarded as genuinely Pauline and as among the earliest written Christian texts, composed in the 50 CE. The letters most scholars accept as authentic include 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 to 2 Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon. These texts predate the Gospels by at least a couple of decades and reflect theological reflection grounded on reminiscence and oral tradition. Paul's letters are not biographical narratives. They are episodic, polemical, and aimed at congregational issues. Yet they contain surprising and important historical signals. Consider 3 types of historical data in Paul. First, Paul repeatedly treats Jesus as a recent historical figure. He speaks of Jesus as born of a woman, as having been crucified under the powers of his time, and as someone whose death and associated events formed the basis of early proclamation. Second, Paul refers to specific named individuals and groups who interacted with the earliest Jesus movement. He knows James as a leader in Jerusalem. He reports disagreements with Peter. He appeals to named companions such as Cephas, Peter, and John, and he mentions house churches and personal loyalties. These remarks suggest real networks of people with contested memories of events. Third, Paul cites what scholars often call pre-Pauline creedal statements, concise formulas that Paul himself attributes to earlier tradition and that he uses as the basis for theological argument. The best known of these is the passage where Paul summarizes that Christ died for our sins, was buried, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and then to more than 500 believers. Paul presents this as received tradition, not his own invention, and dates it theologically to a moment preceding his own call. The significance for historians is that within 2 or 3 decades of the purported events, there existed a set of concise, circulating claims about Jesus' death, burial, and appearances. Those claims are not detailed life biographies, but they are direct, early attestations to central elements that the movement considered historically anchored. Next come the Gospels, composed later than Paul, but drawing on oral and written traditions of differing provenance. Most scholars place Mark as the earliest Gospel, likely written in the 60s, 70s CE, with Matthew and Luke building on Mark and other sources in the 80s CE, and John somewhat later. These dates are approximate and debated, but the broader pattern stands. Gospels are second-generation narratives, shaped by theological purpose and community memory, yet they also preserve sayings and episodes that historians can test against criteria of authenticity. The Gospels are literary constructions, not impartial records, but they often embed localized details, Aramaic expressions, Palestinian place names, and culturally specific behavior that point back to the world they describe. 2 features deserve particular emphasis. First, the Gospels contain Aramaic substratum.
short Semitic phrases and idiomatic expressions preserved within Greek narrative. Examples include words preserved in Greek transliteration and exclamations attributed to Jesus in Aramaic. The presence of Semitic speech forms argues that some materials were transmitted in a linguistic environment where Aramaic was spoken, and that those traditions likely originated among Aramaic-speaking communities. This does not prove every episode in the Gospels, but supports the idea that core fragments trace to Palestinian contexts. Second, the Gospels show signs of literary dependence and redaction. Matthew and Luke often rework Mark, sometimes improving narrative coherence or inserting theological emphases. That literary dependence complicates claims about independent confirmation of details across Gospels, yet where multiple independent strands agree, where Paul, Jesus' traditions in Q, and Mark converge, the case for historicity strengthens. To test the historical reliability of individual sayings or events, historians use methodological criteria. These include multiple attestation, whether a saying or event appears in several independent sources, the criterion of embarrassment, whether a reported fact would have been awkward for early Christians, for instance, reasons given for Jesus' baptism by John, contextual credibility, whether a tradition fits the socio-cultural realities of first-century Palestine, and the criterion of dissimilarity, whether a tradition can be explained as later church invention, or whether it preserves an independent strand, diverging both from earlier Jewish expectations and later Christian theology.
These tools are not infallible. They yield probabilities rather than proofs, and their application requires careful textual and cultural knowledge. Used judiciously, they help separate relatively secure historical cores from later theological embellishments. One instructive case is the crucifixion itself. Multiple independent lines, Paul's letters, Mark's passion narrative, and tacit external references like Tacitus and Lucian converge on the fact of a crucified Jesus. Crucifixion is hardly a flattering detail for origins. It is the humiliating execution reserved for rebels and criminals. That the earliest proclamation emphasizes crucifixion argues strongly that the movement did not invent a prestigious death for a founder. Rather, it framed a scandalous execution as theologically decisive. Many historians see this as a classic instance of the criterion of embarrassment. Since inventing a crucified founder would have been counterproductive, the prevalence of crucifixion in the earliest traditions points to its historical plausibility. Paul's letters and the Gospels also intersect on more localized points. Paul's reference to James as a leader in Jerusalem and to a functioning Jerusalem community aligns with Gospel narratives that portray a family and a local base of followers. Where independent strands intersect, Paul's epistles, Gospel traditions, and the Josephus James notice, the cumulative effect is significant for historical argument, even if each strand taken alone might be contested. Let us pause for a broader methodological comparison. Historians routinely reconstruct the lives of individuals from antiquity on far less documentation than we hold for Jesus. Socrates, for example, is known primarily through a handful of literary portraits, Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes, none of them neutral biography. Yet the historical consensus accepts Socrates as a historical figure. The standards applied to Jesus are consistent with those applied to other ancient figures. Historians seek convergence across independent sources, assess the relative date of those sources, examine internal plausibility, and remain alert to later editorial shaping. Under these standards, most qualified historians judge the existence of a historical Jesus as highly plausible. That judgment is not an affirmation of theological claims about miracles or resurrection. It is a probabilistic conclusion about a first-century Jewish teacher who inspired a movement. To anticipate common objections, it is useful to address several frequently raised points. A common skeptical line argues that the absence of contemporary inscriptions or Roman administrative records mentioning Jesus proves non-existence. This argument misreads the nature of ancient survivals. Most people in antiquity left no administrative trace, and record preservation is highly uneven. Ordinary people, especially itinerant teachers in rural provinces, seldom appear in surviving archives. The presence of later textual attestation, especially early Pauline creeds, gospel traditions tracing to Palestinian contexts, and independent references by Tacitus and Josephus, carries substantial weight precisely because it is what we would expect for a minor provincial figure who came to attention through a movement. In short, absence of evidence in isolated bureaucratic records is weak when judged against a broader field of evidence. Another objection focuses on Josephus's interpolations to cast doubt on his testimony. This skepticism has force when applied to the testimonium, but it does not negate the James passage, which many scholars find authentic, nor does it eliminate the value of cautious reconstructions of Josephus's likely neutral references. A moderate historiographical stance recognizes both the reality of later Christian editorial activity in manuscript traditions and the existence of a plausible Josephian core that references a controversial figure and persistent followers. Skeptics also emphasize the possibility of myth-making and communal retrojection, that early Christians invented a historical founder around whom they built a theological narrative. Yet the sociological and textual evidence tends to cut in the opposite direction. Movements rarely invent detailed crucifixion narratives and named leaders that then attract sustained loyalty and cause confusion in hostile quarters. The internal diversity of early Christian witness, Paul's occasionally critical exchanges with other leaders, the differences between gospel portraits, and varied early Christian theologies argues for complex historical roots rather than a single late invention. What then is the balanced conclusion a historian can responsibly draw? Putting the evidence together with its strengths and limits yields a probabilistic but robust position. Archaeology supplies context and occasional anchors. Inscriptions like the Pilate stone confirm the administrative setting. Ossuaries and material culture illustrate burial practice and language use. Synagogues and village remains show the social texture of Galilee. Greco-Roman authors provide independent corroboration that a movement centered on a crucified figure existed and had become known in the wider empire by the early 2nd century. Josephus, when his writings are carefully parsed, offers at least partial corroboration within a Jewish historical framework. Paul's letters, written within 2 or 3 decades of the events they invoke, contain early creedal formulas and networks of personalities that presuppose a recent historical figure. The Gospels, while later and theologically framed, preserve localized traditions and Semitic linguistic marks that point back to Palestinian origins. Viewed comparatively with other ancient historical reconstructions, this convergence makes the existence of a historical Jesus highly plausible.
The most cautious scholarly statements, therefore, affirm that a Jewish preacher named Yeshua from Galilee existed, attracted followers, was crucified under Roman authority during the governorship of Pilate, and left a movement whose beliefs developed in the decades after his death. At the same time, rigorous historical method imposes strict limits. It cannot adjudicate metaphysical claims. Miracles, resurrection, or divine sonship lie outside the purview of historical demonstration. Those are theological questions, not historical proofs. Historians can report that such claims were made and were central to early proclamation, but they cannot establish supernatural events with the same evidentiary tools that they use for mundane historical claims. Similarly, precise details of Jesus' biography, the full sequence of his sayings, the exact chronology of his activity, or the private conversations he had, remain contested and, in many cases, inaccessible to certain historical recovery. The investigation also leaves open several important scholarly questions. How much of the sayings material reflects early Palestinian oral tradition as opposed to later theological shaping? To what extent do the gospel narratives preserve eyewitness material versus theological reconstruction? How did regional social structures in Galilee and Judea shape the movement's early composition? What can archaeology yet reveal about population density, burial practices, and synagogue life that would refine our picture? Good historical work treats these questions as ongoing puzzles, requiring interdisciplinary attention from philologists, archaeologists, papyrologists, and historians. Before we close, a few practical points on method are worth highlighting for anyone interested in further study. First, provenance matters. Artifacts with documented excavation contexts are far more valuable than those surfaced on the antiquities market. Second, multiple independent attestations are stronger than single mentions. Third, the earlier a source and the closer it is to the context described, the greater its potential evidentiary weight, hence the high value historians place on Paul's letters. Fourth, apparent embarrassments in primary sources can count in favor of historicity when the embarrassing detail would have been counterproductive for originators to invent. Finally, always distinguish between what sources claim for theological reasons and what they report as events. Faithful reading requires parsing authorial intentions. To summarize with clarity, the surviving evidence, when critically examined, supports the high probability that a historical figure known as Jesus of Nazareth lived in the 1st century, preached within a Jewish context, was crucified under Roman rule, and inspired a movement that rapidly crossed provincial boundaries. The available record permits cautious reconstruction on several core points, but stops short of historical proof for supernatural claims.
That calibrated conclusion aligns with the majority view among specialists in the field, who combine textual criticism, comparative ancient historiography, and archaeological context to reach a nuanced verdict. If you want to explore the primary material yourself, here are a few recommended starting points. For a synthetic scholarly overview sympathetic to the historicity question, E.P. Sanders' The Historical Figure of Jesus offers a judicious reconstruction grounded in Jewish context. For a detailed, multi-volume critical study of the historical Jesus, John P. Meyer's A Marginal Jew remains indispensable. For a survey that emphasizes early textual evidence and how historians approach it, Bart D. Ehrman's Did Jesus Exist? Debates denialist positions and defends a historical core. Richard Baucham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses argues for the role of early eyewitness testimony in gospel formation and is useful for thinking about memory and transmission. Geza Vermes's Jesus the Jew provides a sensitive reading of Jesus within first-century Judaism. For work on Josephus and the Testimonium, Louis Feldman and Paul L. Meyer provide accessible introductions and debate. For archaeological context on first-century Galilee and Judea, consult the works of scholars such as William G. Dever and the many site reports collected in edited volumes on Judea and Galilee archaeology. Uncovering the hidden historical evidence of Jesus is an interdisciplinary endeavor. It requires balancing textual scrutiny with archaeological caution, weighing external attestations with internal Christian traditions, and always qualifying conclusions with degrees of probability. None of the surviving sources, taken alone, can settle all questions. Together, however, they form a network of testimony that makes the existence of a historical Jesus highly credible, while reminding us that many specific details remain uncertain and subject to ongoing research. If this exploration has sparked your curiosity, subscribe for more deep dives where we unpack primary texts, examine archaeological reports, and walk through the tools historians use to weigh competing claims. For now, if you want to read further, consider beginning with the following works: E.P. Sanders, The Historical Figure of Jesus; John P. Meyer, A Marginal Jew, Volume 1 is a good entry; Bart D. Ehrman, Did Jesus Exist? Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses; Geza Vermes's Jesus the Jew; Louis H. Feldman, Josephus and Modern Scholarship; William G. Dever, The Lives of Ordinary People in Ancient Israel; and N.T. Wright, Jesus and the Victory of God. Each brings different perspectives and methodological emphases, and together they provide a robust bibliography for anyone who wishes to move from summary to primary source reading. We began with a puzzle, a globally visible religion with surprisingly sparse physical traces tied directly to its founder.
We have traced why that scarcity is unsurprising for a low-status provincial figure, how archaeology offers contextual anchors rather than comprehensive proof, how non-Christian and Jewish testimonies provide independent attestations at the level of a movement and its founder, and how early Christian letters and Gospels preserve a mixture of early tradition and later theological shaping. The responsible historical conclusion is thus dual. The existence of a historical Jesus is well supported by convergent evidence, yet the extraordinary theological claims associated with him remain outside the historian's toolbox and in the domain of faith. Both judgments can coexist. A careful historian affirms probable historical reality while acknowledging the limits of what surviving evidence can conclusively demonstrate. Thank you for joining this investigation into the hidden historical evidence of Jesus. If you found this useful, look at the reading list and consider subscribing for future episodes where we examine specific sources in primary texts, analyze archaeological reports in detail, and offer guided bibliographic paths for deeper study.